Thank you. And also, I don't know how well you could see it, but I could see like Brandy straight on, and it's like proud mama moment right there, right? I mean, it's just like, just you. All right, today's scripture lesson is from the Gospel of Luke. Hear this good news. Every year, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. When he was 12 years old, they went up to the festival according to the custom. After the festival was over, while his parents were returning home, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but they were unaware of it. Thinking he was with their company, they traveled for a day. Then they began looking for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they went back to Jerusalem to look for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished, and his mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." "Why were you searching for me?" he asked. "Didn't you know I had to be in my father's house?" But they did not understand what he was saying to them. Then he went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. But his mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus grew in wisdom, stature, and in favor with God and man. So there was a gentleman once upon a time named Robert Allen Zimmerman, born in Duluth, Minnesota. He knew early in his life that he wanted to change his name to Dillon, spelled D-I-L-L-O-N. Then he discovered a book of poems by Dylan Thomas, spelled D-Y-L-A-N, and he chose to spell his name Dylan using that spelling. Explaining his change of name in a 2004 interview, he said, "You're born, the wrong names, wrong parents. I mean, it happens. You call yourself what you want to call yourself. This is the land of the free." I read Bob Dylan's biography years ago, and one of the things that he shared in his biography is that he had a sense from the time he was a young kid that he was going to do something big with his life. And he knew it wasn't going to happen in Duluth, Minnesota. So he went to college, dropped out his first semester, and at 18 years old, with $40 in his pocket, he got a bus to New York City. When he arrived in New York City, without a real plan, he made his way and found Greenwich Village, and then the rest is history, right? Bob Dylan had a very strong sense of who he was, even when he was a young boy. I lost my place. I remember he was interviewed with Ed Bradley, the late Ed Bradley from 60 Minutes. And you know how intimidating those guys can be, because, the reason we tune in is for the gotcha moments, right? And so this was the first time I'd ever seen a journalist intimidated by the one that they were interviewing. And Bob Dylan, his book had just come out, the one that I mentioned to you, and I guess he had to go on this press tour. You could tell he didn't want to be there, and he didn't want to talk to Ed Bradley. But Ed Bradley, kind of sheepishly at one point, said, "You have a history of whenever you're talking to the press and press briefings and so forth, you never answer the questions directly. How come?" And of course, then 60 Minutes goes back and shows you all the different times he was sitting in front of the press, and they would ask him what he thought was a silly question, and he would just, answer something silly right back. But what he said after that was something that I'll never forget. He looked at Ed Bradley and said, "At the end of the day, I answer to myself and to God, and the press is neither one." I kind of look at the story of Jesus staying in Jerusalem after his parents left as something similar. At a very young age, he had a strong sense of who he was. And even though his staying behind and his parents not knowing was not a good thing, still he wasn't surprised where he was, and he knew that he had to be in his Father's house. Many of us go through life in different ways. However, it seems that one thing that we all do have in common is this. At some point in our journey on this earth, we ask ourselves this question: who am I? And for many of us, it is our God moments that help us to answer that question. Now, I've got 3 listed here. Not because I'm trying to be an overachiever, it's because, well, I'm going to fill up the time if you all don't share anything today. You've heard my stories, and so these won't necessarily be new to you, but I'm hoping that you this morning have a story you want to share, a God moment that help you to learn more clearly who you are as a human being. So if you have a God moment that you want to share, just lift up your hand. Okay, so we have Connie. Connie, since you've got the microphone, you go first. Okay. And then when you're done, hand your microphone to Mike. And Kathy, if you would just come down here for Alan. Okay. All right, all right, Connie, go ahead.
Well, I feel like my God story was the fact that for years I had gone to a church that I just didn't feel like I belonged. And I just felt completely like an extra thumb on my hand. So I finally stopped going there, and I didn't go anywhere for a while. And then a friend that I had met at exercise by the name of Patsy Martin said, "Why don't you try our church?" And I said, "I don't know, Patsy, you know." She said, "No, just come." And so I did, and I walked in the door and I was met with these wonderful people, and I thought, yeah, this is not true. You know, so, okay, I'll give it another chance. Came back, same thing. Wonderful people. I feel like I walked through that door and felt I belonged. And I love this church, and I think God brought me here. And I've met wonderful, wonderful friends, and even one of them is now living in my house. So, I mean, God has just been so good to me, and He helped me find myself. Really.
How lovely. Wonderful. Connie, share your microphone with Mike Wozniak right behind you. Right behind you.
Oh.
Go ahead, Alan.
Mike, you get the mic.
My God moment took place roughly 20 years ago when we were in our old church in downtown Windermere. And there was a young woman who was a member of their church named Mary Williams O'Donnell. And I think she was the 3rd generation of her family that were members of the church. And she was a lovely young woman, I would guess in her mid-20s or so. Everyone loved Mary. She was one of those gals. And she was deaf. I think she lost her hearing very early. She had a childhood or infant illness, and she lost her sense of hearing. So she was deaf. But everybody in the church had a special thing for Mary. She was just great. Well, unfortunately, Mary developed a very serious brain tumor. And the prognosis was not good at all. And so Nancy Cordes came up with this idea of our church having a prayer chain where for 1 week, every hour, someone in the church would be praying for Mary. So I signed up for the 3 to 4 a.m. prayer vigil time, mainly because that was the time I needed to go to the bathroom. But I signed up for 3 to 4 o'clock. And I'd never prayed that long before in my life. You know, an hour of prayer seemed a bit intimidating to me at first. How am I going to pray for an hour? But gradually, I got into it. And I started just carrying on a conversation with God. And I was trying to explain to God how ludicrous this is, what a wonderful thing it would be if Mary would be healed, especially in the context of the prayer vigil which was going on, and how affirming that would be of the power of prayer. And it was a golden opportunity for God to shine. And I found that each day, each night, each morning, 3 to 4 shift, that my prayers became more and more intense. And it was almost as if on that 3 to 4 o'clock shift, I was responsible for keeping Mary alive, which is crazy, but I had sort of that feeling. And it is surprising to me then, as it is now, in retrospect, that Mary's well-being was so vitally important to me, because she wasn't a relative, we weren't even that close friends, we were more acquaintances, but somehow, in this process, Mary's well-being became one of the most important things in the world to me. And Mary kept on going from one medical crisis to the other. There were times when it seemed like she was being stabilized, and then something, and she went through radiation and a number of operations and procedures and things, and the situation just kept deteriorating. Barton was great. He went to visit her probably almost every day when she was in the hospital. And they shared the same birthday, so and Marge and I went to see her in the hospital once, and she was either asleep or unconscious, and so through all this intense prayer that went on longer than a week. It started out with a week and it went on for several weeks. Eventually Mary died. And those of us who were very involved in the prayers chain were very disappointed. And I remember that night, when I went to bed, I shared my anger with God. I told God that I was very disappointed, that I thought God blew it, that he had a golden opportunity to affirm the power of prayer, and he blew it. And I was just furious at God to let this happen. And eventually I fell asleep. And I had a dream. And the first part of the dream, I heard Alan. I heard the word very clearly, Alan. It's the only word that I heard in the dream. And the rest of the dream was God somehow conveying to me that there was no need for me to be distressed or angry, that Mary was in great shape. She was in a wonderful place. She had no more pain, no more operations, no more suffering. Mary was in a great place, and Alan just cool, relaxed. And when I woke up from the dream, I had a totally different attitude about Mary's death. I was totally at peace with her death. The anger and bitterness that I had over her dying, totally gone. And I was very calm about the whole matter. And as I look back at this, there's something very ironic to me from this situation. Here, night after night, from 3 o'clock to 4 o'clock in the morning, was praying for Mary, trying to help Mary get through another day. And that didn't But Mary probably doesn't have a clue. Mary helped me in a very powerful way, because as a consequence of this whole saga, my praying for Mary, I developed a much closer, a much more intimate relationship with God, which still exists today. So I hope to have helped give Mary the gift of life in the way she gave a gift of life to me.
Wow, thank you. Mike.
Wow, that's tough to follow. My brother was 21 years older than me, and we weren't close for a couple reasons. One, he was off to college by the time I was walking and talking. And not only that, he was the complete opposite of me. Anything that I believed in, he did not, and vice versa. And that was okay with that. We still had a friendship whenever we would speak a couple times a year. Growing up, I used to think, we're so different, and some of the things he was going through, some of the challenges he had, the way he lived his life, the way he spent money, the way he always was an optimist about how he was going to turn things around with his money situation, with his muscular dystrophy that he lived with since he was 35 years old when he was diagnosed. And he was an eternal optimist, some people called him. I used to think he was delusional. And at one point, I chose to accept him and love him regardless of my opinion of him. I realized that he was happy. It goes back to what you said earlier, about only answering to God and yourself. And I realized he was in his own personal universe, but he was happy there. So he didn't believe in anything. We were all raised Catholic, but he never believed in anything spiritual. But when he passed, we got him safely in hospice. We took care of all of his needs, and my sister chose to continue to go on a Mediterranean cruise together. And he passed during that cruise. And the 2 days that followed his passing, we saw the most breathtaking end-to-end double rainbow that told us, without a shadow of a doubt, that he was someplace special. And I knew that even though he didn't believe in it, it was his way of saying, okay, maybe there is something here. And last week, I lost my 15-year-old dog, who, before I knew it was time to call the hospice vet, I saw a rainbow, which comforted me that it was time. And the next 3 days after she passed, once again, the circumstances lined for me to be outside at the right moment to see more of those rainbows. So it's a very comforting feeling, and I feel the optimism that my brother lived all the way until his weeks before his death have removed the excuses in my life not to feel some of his optimism in the way I live my life. And I thank him for being with me after he's gone.
Thank you, Mike. Nancy.
I'm going to tell a different story. I was going to tell a different story, but most of you heard the story because I shared it at Adult Sunday School. So I'm going to tell you a different story. When we were in South Carolina, Ed was in the Navy, and in the church that I went to, there was a couple of women that had heard about this priest, Father Diorio from Massachusetts, that supposedly had a gift of healing that God had given him. And he was going to be in a church a couple of hours away from where we lived. So they asked me if I would like to go, and I said, yeah, I'd love to go, because I'd never seen anybody healed or anything, so I was real interested to see how this was going to work. Well, one of the ladies from the church had a daughter who was about 13 years old, and one of her legs was shorter than the other leg. And so when she walked with a limp. And on her way to this church healing service, she had said that she was hoping that God would heal her leg, that he would make her leg the same size as her other leg so she wouldn't limp anymore. So we went to this church, and the service started at 7 o'clock at night, and it was packed. There were maybe 350 people in this church, and we were sort of sitting 3/4 of the way back into the church. And when Father Diorio started his healing service, people were sort of rushing up front because they wanted to make sure that he could touch them. There were people in wheelchairs. There were people who had arthritis gloves on their hands and all this other kind of stuff, wanting to be touched by this Father Diorio. Well, you know, I stood up and I'm looking around, seeing if I could find anybody who was healed or not, because I had never seen anything like that. But at one point in the service, when I was looking up at this priest who was healing these people, it was like all of a sudden, he became like a fluorescent light. There was this really bright white light around him. And at that point, I had been sitting in the pews praying, but all of a sudden, I felt so grateful that God loved us human beings with all our flaws and everything else, that was the real miracle, that God loved us so much. So this little girl got up and she was trying to get to Father Diorio. And I was just picturing, you know, when Jesus was walking around and people were trying to get to him to have him heal them. And every time she tried to get up towards Father Diorio, she was pushed back because of all the crowds that were in front of her. And she came back to the seat and she sat next to me and she was crying and she said, I guess I'm never going to be healed. As people were prayed over by Father Diorio, they left the church. And now it was getting on to be about 11 o'clock at night. And I forget who was, the priest of the church or something, said, okay, well, Father Diorio is really tired right now, and so he's going to leave the church. So we still sat there, and he came down the aisle, the middle aisle where we were. He stopped at the row that we were in, and he beckoned for this little girl to come out to him in the aisle. So she got up and she went out to him, and he placed his hand on her head, and he prayed for a few minutes, and then he gave her something in her hand. And all of a sudden, she fainted. And Father Diorio just continued on and left the church. So her mother was on her knees and she was saying, honey, did God speak to you? And this little girl opened her eyes and she said, God spoke to me and he told me that he loved me. And she said, Father Diorio gave me this crucifix in my hand and it was like burning, it was hot. And she got up, you know, and all of a sudden, her leg was not healed. Her leg was still shorter than the other leg. But she was so thrilled because she heard God telling her that he loved her. And she couldn't wait to get her father on the telephone and say that God told her that he loved her just the way she was. Her leg was unhealed, but her psychological and spiritual self was healed. And at that point, I realized that sometimes we pray for healing for a certain thing, and God may not heal us in that particular way, but he heals us in the way that we need it the most.
Lovely. You've got David Housel.
When Linda and I moved into the house we live in now, Claremont, shortly thereafter we discovered we were constantly having issues with ants coming in the kitchen. So we retained a exterminator, and no matter what he did, it seemed to be ineffective. It just, they seemed to, you know, we were working hard to make sure everything was cleaned up, and these ants kept coming. And so I had this bad attitude about ants. And they became my arch enemy. And I was furious when I saw ants. And so there's one day, you know, I tend to find a lot of stuff in nature speak to me. And I was out in the back, and we have this lanai that has an extension on it we put on after we moved in there. And it has these steel things going up, aluminum I guess they are, and these little channels. And I just happened to be passing by, and I was like, I heard this rustle or this noise, this stopped me, and I just turned and looked to my right, and here in this little channel were ants going up. And I looked at them, and this furious feeling in me, you know, I just wanted to go get some kind of spray or something. And it was like something said to me, pay attention, look at them. And that scripture came back that said, go to the ant, thou sluggard, consider her ways and be wise. And I just thought, I don't feel like a sluggard. But, you know, there's something they're teaching me. They are so persistent. They are so dedicated to whatever their task is that they're almost invincible. And I thought, thank you for teaching me that in the smallest, most inconspicuous thing, you have something to teach me.
Lovely. Ed, do you have a story?
Yeah. My story is insignificant compared to these others, and I don't really know what it means to me, but it was a God moment, so I'll share it. It fits in well with today's service because one of the opening songs was all things that are possible, and then the story of Jesus getting lost or his parents thinking he was lost. So this is a story about lost and found. A number of years ago, I worked for a number of years at the Walt Disney World Swan and Dolphin. And it was a very big complex, total of 90 acres, and down by Epcot. And one day I happened to be walking down the corridor that leads to the pool area. It's on the first floor, you walk straight out, and you come to the pool area, and if you continue, it follows over to the Swan. So I was walking down that corridor, and there was a couple with a small child that was kind of in a carriage, I guess. And the child was clearly distraught, crying and very upset and everything. And since I worked there, I was supposed to engage with guests. I said, oh, I'm sorry, is there something wrong? And they stopped and talked to me, and they said, well, our daughter had a little, I think it was a bear, a little stuffed animal, a bear or something like that, and she lost it. And it was like her most favorite item that she had, and we've been looking all around trying to find it, we can't find it. I said, well, where did you come from? He said, well, we came from the pool. We were just out by the pool area, and we were walking, we're coming back in. I said, well, okay, I'll look around in my walks. I walk around a lot. So I said, but if I happen to find it, I said, how long are you going to be here? They said, well, we're leaving this afternoon about 2 o'clock. I said, all right, okay. So then I continued my walk, which for those of you that might be familiar with the hotel complex, you can walk from the Dolphin, you can walk through the pool area, and then you can go over towards the Swan. So I said, well, I'll just make the Great Circle route and look around. And at the time, there happened to be a huge tent set up on the Swan Terrace. And they used this tent for functions and lunches and dinner and stuff. And well, this was after whatever function they had. So the only thing that was in the tent was this long line of tables with tablecloths on them. And it was, maybe 200 feet long. It was very long. So I'm saying to myself, God, help me find this little bear for this kid, because clearly she was very distraught, and it would make her very happy. So I'm kind of praying this, and I'm walking along, went through the pool area, went into the tent just to walk through it to get to the other side. And right about in the middle, kind of a little voice in my head said, look under the table. And I did. I looked under the table, and there was this little bear under the table, right there. I said, oh, God. It gives me chills to even think about it, because I wasn't really searching actively as I was walking. I was just kind of observing. So now I got this bear, and I said, okay, now what? So I went to Jack Adler, who was the head person at the bell stand. And I said, Jack, there's going to be a couple in a carriage come through about 2 o'clock. I says, and they lost this bear. Can you make sure that the little child gets it? And he did that. And I talked to him later that day or the next day, and he says, oh my God, he said, that little kid was so excited, and the mother came and hugged me and said, this is the best moment of our trip here. So I don't know what all means, but it was a special God moment for me.
Wow, that's lovely. Martha.
Okay, I was caretaker for my mother. My mother was totally deaf without her hearing aids. And so she would wake in the middle of the night. At first, it was a troublesome thing for her because she was awake, she couldn't hear anything, she couldn't get up. But after a little while, my mother began telling me that this little man came to her in the middle of the night and was singing to her. And then the next thing she told me, and sometimes he brings a choir. And he sings me songs that I've never heard before. And Mom, it's hallucinations, she's had some before, and so forth. Then this one night, I was sitting with her, holding her hand. And Mother's face lit up in such joy that I didn't know where it came from. And she said, the angels are here. And I said, oh. And she said, and the angel says you need a hug, so she's going to come around and give you a hug. Well, I didn't feel it, but I felt the joy from my mother's face. So maybe that was the hug that the angel gave me, I don't know. But after that, I would go into my mother's room periodically, and I would always know when they were there because her face changed. And it was just such a beautiful moment. And I began understanding that the ultimate healing is joining God.
And I find it interesting, Martha, as you share your story, what you could not see nor hear, she could. It's lovely. Yes, Ruthie.
As a young lady, I was always felt lost, lonely, rejected. I've never had any friends. I quit school when I was 16 because it was boring. I didn't get anything out of it. You're learning something that you don't use mainly. But I got married when I was 16, and my husband was 17. I became depressed, and he started drinking and running around. Barton Sage started out by saying, "Who am I?" My first question was there really a God? Because I wasn't raised in church. My parents would have us say a blessing at the meals, but I didn't know why we were saying it. And they would take us to church on Christmas and Easter, like they do. But one night, I was living with my husband and two of my daughters in a little town in Deering, Georgia. And I was to the point where I wanted to commit suicide. I saw no reason for living and dying, and that's it. Makes no sense to me. Well, there's more to it than that. I went outside this night that I was feeling very depressed, and I looked up into the sky and I said, if there's a God, I want to know it. I want to know it. So help me, God. I want to know the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Well, I went inside and went to bed. And next day, or two, I don't remember exactly how long it was, but it wasn't long. I had been outside for something. I must have went to the mailbox or something, and I started to walk back up into this trailer that we lived in. And I heard, go and get that Bible your grandmother gave you, and you've never read it. And I said, I didn't think about it. Where did this come from? I just went and got it. Started reading it. And the more I read, the more I wanted to read. Because it was telling me about this man, Jesus, that loved me. And I felt reading it that there was so much love in there that it was the most valuable book I had ever. I mean, people don't know the value of that book. You leave it on the coffee table, never read it, you don't know the value of that book. It changed my life. The next day that after hearing that, I walked down to the mailbox, it was down a few ways, and I felt like I was walking on clouds. And then I wrote my grandmother, and I told her, I said, I can't tell you how much I've gotten out of this. And she sent me a postcard, and she said, I hope you get into a church soon. Well, there was only one or two churches. It was just a very, very small town. And the day that I received the postcard, the minister from the Baptist church and two of his lady members came knocking on my door. And I was so excited when they said who they were, I almost dragged them in. I said, let me tell you what I found. I said, I can't explain how this happened, but I know there's someone that loves me. And all this time, I still didn't have any close friends like I've got here. I still felt lonely, and lost to a certain extent because I didn't see where I belonged anywhere. It's hard to explain, but during this, a little bit after this time, I came to be diagnosed with bipolar. And I've come to the conclusion, I saw the spiritual world so vividly. And then there was the physical world I'm living in that I got confused. It was like a trauma. And I've been in, I had been diagnosed, I think, around 71, early 71 or something like that. And I've been in and out of the hospital for many times, up until 2009. I mean, I had to go through the straitjacket and people trying to tie me down to the bed and everything else. But the one time that I was laying on the bed strapped down, it was like I was hurting, you know, because your arms are hurting and whatever, and it was like I could just relax. Just relax. And it did. I calmed down, and I felt much better. So I had to deal with this bipolar until 2009. They give me medicine, and it was like every 3 years I'd get used to it, and they'd have to change it. So then, in 2009, in January, I went into the hospital, and they got me on some medicine that really has helped me, and I'm still on it. But I couldn't have done it without Jesus. I couldn't have. I was led to this church through NAMI. I was a member of NAMI. And I was led here because they had a program that came and that wanted to let the church know what it was about. And I went home, and I decided, well, maybe I'll go back. And I did, and I'm so grateful I did. Because now I got friends, and people that love me. So, I can see that every day. If I get down, I see where I began, and I know that God is real. There is a God, I call it the universal spirit of consciousness. It's energy, whatever. I don't see it as a person. I see Jesus as a human being, just like us. He went through what we had to go through. That's how he knows what we need. And when you see Jesus just like you can understand. I said he feels like a brother to me, or a soulmate. He's so real, you know. We talk, but people think maybe I'm hallucinating there again, like I call it, but it's not. You ask me why I smile, I got good reason to smile. And I love you all.
God bless you. Well, as it turned out, you did not need me to tell my 3 stories today. So I'll conclude with a message that I got into when I was in a deep meditation one day. And the voice and the message in my meditation was, your voice comforts. Your voice brings healing. Your voice helps others understand more deeply. It is unjust and irresponsible to keep your voice to yourself. So thank you for sharing your voice today, because it has brought me comfort